It took me 50 years to integrate the near-death experience I had as a child falling out of the car when I was 3. And it did take me a long time to understand the 1970 experience with Swami Muktananda and Ram Dass. So to give you a context, AJ, I was a 21-year-old student at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. I was a math major, and it was also the height of the Vietnam anti-war movement. And I was involved in that at my university in student protests. And so it was kind of a heavy time, right? There was lots of polarization in the country. I was facing being drafted and sent to Vietnam, and I was a pacifist. I didn't want to go to war. I didn't want to go to prison. I didn't want to go to Canada. And those were the three options that people had in my position. So it was a very heavy time, basically. And I just went, some friends of mine told me about a presentation at Dinkelspiel Auditorium on Stanford campus that was a couple-hour talk by Baba Ram Dass, and it was him introducing Swami Muktananda to the country. It was the first time Muktananda was in the U.S. He didn't speak English at that time. So what happened to me briefly was Ram Dass was talking about meditation, which I now know is probably a Ramana Maharshi meditation, where he said, imagine that you're sitting on a bridge over a river, and the river is everything in time and space. So all your thoughts, emotions, sensations, everything occurring in time and space, including the thought of you being on a bridge over a river, looking at it all. And even so, there's still awareness there, noticing what's flowing through the river. So I thought, okay, I'll try that. And I was sitting there, closed my eyes, and I was looking at that. And pretty soon I noticed my breathing. I noticed the blood circulating through my system. And when I had the thought that I don't need to keep paying attention for my breathing and the blood circulation to continue, it was like, bam, a whole new reality opened up. And it was the reality that was outside of time and space, or a better way of saying it is time and space are a small part of what's flowing through this much more immense reality. And what I felt right away was bliss, unlike I've ever known before or since. And it was such a sharp contrast to what I had been feeling with the heaviness of my life and the politics that were going on. I felt this bliss for a while, and I literally wasn't in my mind. I was awareness, pure awareness, watching everything, including the little parts of my mind. And I was aware of my body, but I wasn't stuck in my body at that point. And so eventually, a few minutes later, I opened my eyes, I looked around. There were several thousand people in this auditorium. And I looked, and all of them were glowing with auras. And Ram Dass kept talking. Muktananda and his monks kept chanting. Just as an explanation, Muktananda was known as a Shaktipat guru. And Shaktipat is the transmission of a very tangible physical energy. And there were many people, I found out later, that would look at a picture of him or have an experience like that and be sent out of sort of the ordinary reality into a more transcendent experience. I was there with my girlfriend with whom I lived. We got up and went out, and I looked around, and the trees, on campus also had auras. They were glowing. The asphalt paths, like the bike paths and walking paths, didn't glow with an aura, but they were alive. And I could feel the connection between every part of them and every part of me. So we went home, and I tried to go to sleep, because that was an evening program. I tried to go to sleep, and I found myself unable to sleep. So I went downstairs, and all that night I experienced the beginning of creation. And it wasn't a theoretical thing. It was, I experienced being the divine presence that wanted to create. There was an impulse to create. And in that impulse to create, if everything was God, everything was undifferentiated, there was no creation. So God said, okay, there has to be a distinction here, and the only distinction was between God and not God. So that was the first duality. Now, as I said, I had no spiritual framework to sort of put what I was observing into some kind of cognitive context, but I was raised Catholic, and so this imagery came to me in the form of kind of the creation story. So I watched God creating archangels and angels and men and women and everything, and there was all forms of duality. And it was just flooding through me, and I was living it. So eventually my girlfriend got up, and the next morning came downstairs, and I was excited to say, look, this is what I'm experiencing. And she had no idea what I was talking about. She thought, I had lost it, basically. And so what happened was I went through these things. I was traveling out of my body. I was going up into much bigger universes. So our Earth would shrink to the size of an atom. The sun would shrink, and I would be in a much bigger universe. Or I would look at, my hand and see, my flesh there, and it would expand so that the atoms and molecules in whatever was around me were as big as suns and stars and earths and all that. So I was going through all these different experiences. Now I would say I was traveling in different dimensions, and I was experiencing life without the small filter, the small contracted filter of my body and my personality. I was like a math major at Stanford before they had a computer science major. And but so I studied programming and all of that. So when I was literally out of my mind, I could observe my mind, and without sort of the inertia of my consciousness being stuck in it, my mind could actually operate very quickly. And in this expanded space, I looked at it as like, okay, so I've got a little computer here that's going very quickly. I'm going to give it the problem to solve the Vietnam War. And it went, for a while, it went very fast, and it came back with a solution. And that solution was, in the state of consciousness I was in, I went and visited some of these friends that told me about Ram Dass and Muktananda. And I could beam from my heart chakra into theirs energy, and it would move them into an altered state of consciousness. I thought at the time it was identical to the state of consciousness I was in. And in that consciousness where you're one with everyone and everything, you can't hurt anything. In fact, one of those friends whom I is a good friend of mine now. We connected 45 years later. He's a retired psychologist and a Sufi teacher. He said that when I was walking around campus, he could feel me from about 4 blocks away. He knew I was coming. He knew it was my presence coming. Uh, so there was some strong energetic phenomenon going on that was kind of outside of my personality's awareness. But I knew that I could transmit this feeling, and therefore you wouldn't hurt anyone. And I thought, okay, I'll go to Washington, D.C., and I'll beam Congress, and I'll beam Nixon, and, you know, it will end the war because you won't have war in that state of consciousness. And then somehow I had heard that actually President Nixon was coming to San Jose, which was a half an hour from Palo Alto, where I was at school. And he was going to be in a motorcade, passing through the city on this visit. And I thought, okay, I'll just go down and stand by the side of the road. And when he goes by, I'll just beam him. So if you're my girlfriend, Patty, you're thinking, oh my God, he's going to get arrested or shot because he's a lunatic, right? He's crazy. Whereas to me, it was perfectly rational. Briefly, what happened was after I didn't eat or sleep, my girlfriend took me over to the student health center, and 15 minutes later, I was in Stanford Hospital in their psych ward, right? And they gave me strong antipsychotic medication, which, by the way, didn't change my ability to be out of my body, or it didn't affect the state of consciousness. I stayed in that hospital for 4 weeks talking to the psychiatrists, and they didn't understand anything I was talking about. I could be helpful to other people. We had group therapy, and I was very insightful about what was going on with other people. But when I talked about what I was experiencing, nobody could relate. So I ended up staying there, and actually I did leave Stanford Hospital against their medical advice. I just walked out one day. I was able to do that. But I went back to Minnesota, which is where I was from. And my parents, my mom talked me into checking into a hospital there and having a physical evaluation. After a week of them doing all kinds of tests, and everything was coming back normal. There was nothing physically wrong with me. But in that week at the hospital in St. Paul, Minnesota, I had refused to take medication. I knew at that point that wasn't good for me. So after I tried to leave that hospital, they put me on a hold and said they were going to commit me against my will. And that was the whole one flew over the cuckoo's nest thing, because I knew the medication wasn't going to work. I imagined from, the Ken Kesey story, they would then do electroshock therapy. And when that didn't work, I imagined they were going to do the prefrontal lobotomy and scramble my brain. And that was my worst nightmare. That seemed to me worse than dying. I think this is a kind of a good example of the psychiatrist in the hospital that was trying to commit me wasn't, an evil person or anything. He was doing what he thought was in my best interest and, interest of my health. He just was totally ignorant about spiritual emergence and emergency, which at that time everybody was pretty much, because it wasn't even an idea. It wasn't a category. But so he was trying to help me, but he was doing things that were hurting me. I had been 6 or 8 weeks or so in a state of bliss and expansion, and I was totally open emotionally. I was loving everyone. I was feeling connected with everyone. When the psychiatrist told me he was putting me on a medical hold and he was going to convene a panel of judges to get me declared, mentally insane and held against my will, I was both furious with him. I was really angry, and I was terrified. I was totally terrified. So I think somehow that the energy of that sort of contracted me back into, my body. Uh, my you know, I had not wanted to go home with my mother, who was my only contact that week when I was in my hospital, because my father was traveling on a business trip. And my mother was extremely anxious. She was basically scared out of her mind. And her energy was difficult for me to be around. And when my father came back from his trip and we talked, he told the psychiatrist, look, I don't believe that treating somebody, giving them drugs against their will is going to be helpful. There was a funny part of this story. My dad said, he's different, but, he's not, he's lucid. He's not crazy. The psychiatrist said, well, paranoid schizophrenics have the ability to recognize people that are useful to them and put on an appearance of normality for those people. But he's still a paranoid schizophrenic. And when I heard that, I thought, I am so screwed here because even if I'm normal, they're going to categorize me as crazy. So my father didn't go along with this, and I agreed to go home with them. And so the psychiatrist let me out of the hospital. And I went from being totally open. And so another context that's really important here is that when this happened, when I saw Muktananda and Ram Dass, what the meaningfulness of my human existence, what had been my whole meaning, dwindled into an insignificant little speck compared to the immensity of the meaning of all of these energies and beings and everything that's operating on this multidimensional level. So, and that included things like I really loved my girlfriend, but in this new state, that was in this teeny little speck and I could hardly feel it. So one of the things that happened was after I got out of the hospital, it was Christmas break at school, my girlfriend came back out to Minnesota. And as soon as I saw her, I felt this real heart connection with her again. It's like I knew I was back into, if you will, ordinary reality. That's how I got out. And I spent the next 6 months, I went back to Stanford. I made up the incompletes I had made, I had gotten from going into the hospital in the first quarter. So I made up what incompletes I could and then I went back to school the spring quarter and I graduated. After I went back and graduated, I spent the next probably 15 years working in high tech in the computer industry. So I did, applications engineering, I did engineering project management, I did marketing, I did sales. I worked in high tech for many years. It wasn't until I was 40 that I went back to graduate school. And I did that because I was eventually just working for the money in high tech. It was paid well, but it didn't have a lot of heart and meaning to me anymore. So I went back to graduate school and I basically became a clinical psychologist specializing in working with people with trauma and abuse in their backgrounds, childhood abuse, and how to integrate into, back into their lives. And that's really helpful in working with your spiritual experiences and the traumas that are, sometimes associated with that. It all started when I was 3 years old, 3.5 years old to be precise. I lived at the time in Columbus, Ohio, and my folks and I, it was uh, my father and my mother, my 2.5 year older brother, and my 1 year old younger brother were in this car. It was one of these old Nash Ramblers where the back doors opened frontwards. And in those days, they didn't have seat belts. And so we had been visiting relatives in Minnesota, and we were driving back through Wisconsin towards Ohio. And my older brother and I were in the back seat alone, and we were fooling around, probably wrestling. And I must have hit the door handle of this car door, and the door flew open, and the wind sucked me out. And my folks told me that a trucker was driving behind, and he saw me fly out of the car and land on my head on the gravel shoulder of this 2-lane highway. And as I said, the car was going about 60 miles an hour. And I was knocked unconscious. And so when I was growing up, my parents told me, "Hey, when you were a kid, you fell out of the car and you landed on your head, and you had 10 stitches in your scalp, and you were fine." And I believed that when I was a child growing up, but I had some indications over time that this affected me much more deeply than I had given it credit for. And I really didn't start exploring this until I was 40 years old, and I had worked in high tech for many years. I had gone back to graduate school in psychology, and I got curious about what had really happened to me. So I did a couple of things. There was a professor at this school, the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto, that was a hypnosis specialist. And so I did a couple of hypnosis regressions with him. And what I discovered doing that was that I had this crushing feeling in my chest. It was as if, kind of the cartilage in my chest had been damaged. And what it felt like was breathing through cut glass. It was extremely painful just to breathe. And this physical pain was the strongest sensation that I got through these hypnotic regressions. One of the things, I did a 5-year training in psychodrama, and this was actually outside of school. It was a private group, and we would practice on one another doing psychodramas. And in psychodrama, there's a sort of a natural regression that happens. And one time I was being the protagonist, the person that they were working with, and I found myself spontaneously lying on my back on the floor, reaching up and crying. And I could feel in this psychodrama that I was reaching for my mother. But I had no real clue about what that was about until a little later. So I kind of got enough clues that somehow this experience when I was 3 affected me more strongly than I had thought. And so I decided I would talk to my mom and dad and have them walk through what happened in their memory. So this was, as I said, like almost 40 years after this had experienced, they had experienced it, but their memory was pretty clear. So they were the ones, they said, yeah, this trucker was driving behind. they, I fell out of the car. He picked me up. He was holding me in his arms, and there was blood everywhere because it was a scalp wound, and scalp wounds bleed. Uh, my folks had to drive about 30 miles to the nearest little town in Wisconsin to find a place that would help me. And they said I was unconscious that whole time. They gave me to the nurse at this little clinic. They took me away. My mom and dad went into the restroom, of this little clinic, and both of them threw up and had diarrhea. So they were really strongly affected by that. I can imagine they thought I was going to die. They told me that a nurse came out and explained to them that when I woke up in this little clinic room, I started screaming and thrashing around. So they wrapped me up in a sheet and they tied me down while they cleaned up my scalp. And my first memory was from that room. I saw a very bright light. And I think there were bright lights in this clinic room. There was a nurse dressed all in white, and she was carrying a white porcelain bowl that had water in it. And the lights reflected off of that bowl, and it scared me. But what I was seeing internally was this bright spiritual light. I had this sense of there's a wise being kind of in this light that was there. That's really my near-death experience kind of recollection of this. Basically, as PMH Atwater, who's a near-death researcher, explains that it's very common for children under 5 with their near-death experiences to not have the regular imagery, and in fact it even has a different effect on younger kids having near-death experiences. Mostly I think the effect of that is there's a yearning to understand what happened spiritually. Going back to what happened physically, they gave me back to my parents. They said that I did have 10 stitches, that I probably had a concussion, but that I should be kept awake for a while. But they gave me back to my parents, and they got in the car. My mom got in the back seat. She put a pillow on her lap, and they laid me down on this pillow, and she said as they were driving back to Ohio, which was, I don't know, probably an 8 or 10-hour drive from where they were, that I would start crying and reaching up for my mom and want to be comforted. And my mom said to me that she was so frightened that I had been hurt and that I was fragile that she wouldn't hold me, she wouldn't comfort me that way. And as I uncovered all of this, I realized that the physical pain was terrible, but the emotional pain was even worse. And somewhere in that time period, I kind of internalized that my mom didn't love me because she wouldn't comfort me, and she wouldn't comfort me because it was my fault that I had fallen out of the car. We were screwing around with, my older brother and I in the back seat. And so, that was why she wasn't comforting me. And I generalized that somehow at the time to feeling like God wasn't there for me. God wasn't comforting me. And it took me many, many years to understand, working through what had happened with all of this. I'm pretty sure that, yes, I had a lot of pain for probably several weeks after I got back to Ohio. nobody ever talked to me about that. I experienced that physically with that hypnotic regression. I did a lot of work with this as a person in my 40s, as I was doing my own therapy work, as I was trying to heal from the trauma of what had happened. And among other things, I worked with a therapist who was a woman named Bonnie Greenwell, who was a Ph.D. And her expertise was in Kundalini awakenings. And she helped me because in my 40s, I would go through these Kundalini Kriyas where I would basically be lying on my bed and I would thrash around like I was having a grand mal seizure for anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half. And my hands would go like this and make these spontaneous gestures that I couldn't duplicate by myself afterwards. And they would go into mudras, and sometimes I would be saying words which I believe are probably Sanskrit. And I would just thrash around, and this would go on, as I said, for an hour to an hour and a half. And I learned that all I could do is go along for the ride. And this was a Kundalini Kriya, which is the Kundalini is a very strong energy going through your system. And when it hits obstructions, it kind of blasts through them. And it's an evolutionary process. If you go along for the ride, you're okay. I never hurt myself in doing these very kind of violent movements. But I went through those for about 5 years. And Bonnie said when I fell out of the car that had probably initiated the beginning of that Kundalini process. And it was a slow process. It lasted for many years. I have some pictures of me when I was 3 before this experience, and then shortly afterwards. And you can see that I'm pretty carefree and happy in the first picture. And there's almost a haunted look of sadness in my eyes in this picture that was taken shortly afterwards. One of the things I want to say about this to people is that sometimes these spiritual experiences are rough. They're not all love and light. And it's important to be able to tolerate what you think and feel and let yourself feel and sort of re-experience these things, but with the support of your spirit. And when you do that, the parts of us, the human parts that are fragile, that do get hurt, that do suffer, when they can connect with the eternal part of us that was never born and never dies, and that's always okay no matter what is happening, that's healing for these hurt, human parts of us. So developing the capacity to touch into your transcendent self at the same time as you're witnessing and being present to what's happening in your human life, your human parts, is really important. The person who helped me understand the best what had happened with Muktananda was Adyashanti. He's a spiritual teacher. He was training as a Zen Buddhist for 15 years, and he had a spontaneous awakening. And he's been in the Bay Area for many years as a spiritual teacher, helping people awaken. And he's quite popular, actually, and quite good. I really like Adya. I volunteered in his office for 7 years to help promote his stuff. But my first meeting with Adya was an hour and a half one-on-one interview that he gave me. He didn't do that very frequently, but I had a friend who knew him, and what Adya said is, yes, at the Muktananda and Ramdas event, you had a partial awakening. You awakened to the transcendent, but it was a partial awakening. And if you had kept expanding your awareness, eventually you would have come back to that non-dual state, which would be a full awakening, where you're fully aware of your transcendent nature and your human nature simultaneously. It's not one or the other, it's both and all the time. And that process was interrupted for you. So over these many years, I've been doing the rest of the work to keep opening and awakening. And so that's what happened to me. I had a partial awakening, and then I contracted out of it when they tried to lock me up. And then I spent many years studying meditation and and trying to understand what had happened and to continue to awaken.
We hope you enjoyed our Spiritual Awakenings International highlights with ajparr. Spiritual Awakenings International hosts 3 live online events each month, featured speakers events, and experiencers sharing circles in English and in Spanish. To learn more, please go to our Spiritual Awakenings International YouTube channel and website, that's spiritualawakeningsinternational.org. We hope to see you there.